To name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment of the poem, which derives from the pleasure of step-by-step discovery. To suggest, that is the dream. To evoke an object little by little so as to bring to light a state of the soul, or inversely, to choose an object and bring out of it a state of the soul through a series of unravelings. Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 19th century French poet Stephane Mallarmé. Mallarmé is an incredibly important poet because he, along with people like Baudelaire and Rimbaud, really sort of innovate the Symbolist movement. The Symbolists basically were interested in the idea of using language to evoke non-naturalistic experiences. So symbols obviously were quite important to them. This was largely in reaction to the naturalists, people who took an approach to poetry and prose and the visual arts that was very much rooted in here's how things actually are. The symbolists, both literary and visual arts, symbolists became interested in the idea that things stand in for other things, that the use of language and the use of sound and the use of imagery is representative, that it's not meant to reflect reality or real life or real experience, but is meant to evoke these larger concepts. So that quote that I had opened with is from Mallarmé himself, talking about the sort of use of implication, the use of suggestion, the use of evocation, rather than direct, clear, realistic description of things. So I'm reading just a small selection of Mallarmé's poems out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. And what the editors say in terms of Mallarmé's project, the Symbolist project, is that they were trying to figure out what makes poetry poetry, and not just another way of speaking about experience. It meant liberating poetic language from conventional everyday uses such as the communication of facts and reporting of events in newspapers. It meant refusing standard syntax, embracing incompleteness, moving fluidly among strange and disconnected images, and focusing on the sounds as much as the sense of words. The result was a kind of writing so deliberately strange and difficult that it has bewildered readers from its time to our own. A lot of the naturalists, a lot of the realists, people like Marcel Proust and Leo Tolstoy, were not necessarily big fans of the Symbolists because it is literarily and artistically challenging. Actually, I think when people think of literary poetry, they often are thinking of the Symbolists, where you have these sort of fascinating but very difficult to follow threads of thought that are reflected in symbolic language, in deliberate obscurity, in ideas that aren't fully vocalized, etc., etc. I think that's what people often think of when they think of like high art poetry, is the Symbolists. And Mallarmé was a major figure in this. He was one of the defining leaders of the Symbolist movement. His work becomes more experimental over the course of his career. He wrote for a good long time. And actually, he's one of his final works, which is not in the Norton Anthology because it's very difficult to reproduce in something like an anthology. It kind of needs its own standalone piece. is called A Throw of the Dice Will Never Abolish Chance. This is one of the first poems that I'm aware of where the poem itself is a work of visual art. So, like medieval illuminated manuscripts, for instance, are beautiful. There is decoration, there is style and artistic flair to them, but you could take the words of the poem and put them in a plain script, and the poem itself would still be that poem. A Throw of the Dice Will Never Abolish Chance is different. The visual layout on the page, including these long gaps within lines, blank pages, different font choices, etc., all of that is specifically crafted by Mallarmé to be part of the poem itself. That's a very, very modernist thing to do. And he was doing it decades before the modernists, the high modernists, capital M, really started picking up on this idea. So he was definitely this innovator, this thinker about what poetry could do. But earlier in his career, Mallarmé was much more conventional, while also challenging the boundaries of that convention. So one of his most famous poems, the one that I'm going to read to you, it's fairly long, but I'm going to read the whole thing, is The Afternoon of a Fawn. This is a cool poem. It's one of his most anthologized, one of his most famous. It has classical subject matter, which is very, very traditional. Like if you go back to the neoclassicals in the late 18th century into the early 19th century, Greco-Roman subject matter is incredibly popular. It's a pastoral poem, which again is very, very traditional, very, very conventional in many ways. And in French, the lines are Alexandrines. That is, they have 12 metric feet, or 12 syllables, which is a very traditional composition structure in French, apparently. I don't know. I don't read French. I read French literature and English translation sometimes, but I don't read French as such. But the Alexandrine is a traditional French meter for poetry and for classical drama. Afternoon of a Fawn is in Alexandrines. So he's using these very traditional components, classical subject matter, the pastoral, the Alexandrine, and yet he is undercutting some of the certainties and stabilities that traditions seem to suggest, in part by introducing these elements of ambiguity, and in part by introducing components of eroticism that are sort of indirect, by raising questions about the reality of the scene that's being depicted. Is this real? Is this a dream? Whose dream would it be? Etc., etc. So all of these things, you'll see as I read the poem, there are these, again, lovely, lovely lines, these beautiful images, but there's also a great amount of uncertainty, and there's a lot of stuff that represents these larger concerns with things like truth, beauty, love, interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, the connection between the poet, persona, and nature, etc., etc. All of these things are developed through symbols. So this is Afternoon of a Fawn. I am at the very tail end of a cold, by the way, so I will try and read this as beautifully as I can. We'll see how it goes. So The Afternoon of a Fawn. These nymphs that I would perpetuate, so clear and light their carnation that it floats in the air heavy with leafy slumbers, My doubt, night's ancient horde, pursues its themes in branching labyrinths, which, being still, the veritable woods themselves, alas, reveal my triumph as the ideal fault of roses. Consider. If the women of your glosses are phantoms of your fabulous desires, Fawn, the illusion flees from the cold blue eyes of the chaster nymph like a fountain gushing tears, but the others all in size, you say, compares to a hot wind through the fleece that blows at noon? No, through the motionless and weary swoon of stifling heat that suffocates the morning. Save from my flute no waters murmuring in harmony flow out into the groves. And the only wind on the horizon no ripple moves, exhaled from my twin pipes, and swift to drain the melody in arid drifts of rain, is the visible, serene, and fictive air of inspiration rising as if in prayer. Relate, Sicilian shores, whose tranquil fens my vanity disturbs, as do the suns, silent beneath the brilliant flowers of flame. That cutting hollow reeds my art would tame, I saw far off against the glaucous gold of foliage twined to where the springs run cold, an animal whiteness languorous swaying to the slow prelude in the pipes were playing. This flight of swans, no naiads, rose in a shower of spray. Day burns inert in the tawny hour, and excess of hymen has escaped away without a sign from one who pined for the primal A. And so, beneath a flood of antique light, as innocent as are the lilies white, to my first ardors I awoke alone. Besides sweet nothings from their lips made known, kisses that only mark their perfidy, my chest reveals an unsolved mystery, the tooth marks of some strange majestic creature. Enough. Arcana such as these disclose their nature only through the vast twin reeds played to the skies that, turning to music all that clouds the eyes, dream in a long solo that we amused the beauty all around us by confused equations with our credulous melody, and dream that the song can make love soar so high that, purged of all ordinary fantasies of back or breast, incessant shapes that rise in blindness, it distills sonorities from every empty and monotonous line. Then instruments of flight, syrinx malign, at lakes where you attend me, bloom once more. Long shall my discourse from the echoing shore depict those goddesses. By masquerades I'll strip the veils that sanctify their shades, and when I've sucked the brightness out of grapes to quell the flood of sorrow that escapes, I'll lift the empty cluster to the sky, avidly drunk until evening has drawn nigh, and blow in laughter through the luminous skins. Let us inflate our memories, O nymphs. Piercing the reeds, my darting eyes transfixed, plunged in the cooling waves' immortal necks, and cries of fury echo through the air. Splendid cascades of tresses disappear in shimmering jewels. Pursuing them, I find there at my feet two sleepers intertwined, bruised in the languor of duality, their arms about each other heedlessly. I bear them still entangled to a height where frivolous shadow never mocks the light, and dying roses yield the sun their scent, that with the day our passions might be spent. I adore you, wrath of virgins, fierce delight of the sacred burdens, writhing naked flight, from the fiery lightning of my lips that flash with the secret terror of the thirsting flesh, from the cruel one's feet to the heart of the shy, whose innocence abandoned suddenly, watered in frenzied or less woeful tears. Gay with the conquest of those traitorous fears, I sinned when I divided the disheveled tuft of kisses that the gods had raveled, for hardly had I hidden an ardent moan deep in the joyous recesses of one, holding by a finger that her swan-like pallor from her sister's passion might be tinged with color, the little one unblushingly demure, when from my arms, loosened by death obscure, this prey, ungrateful to the end, breaks free, spurning the sobs that still transported me. Others will lead me on to happiness, their tresses knotted round my horns, I guess. You know my passion that, crimson with ripe seeds, pomegranates burst in a murmur of bees, and that our blood, seized by each passing form, flows toward desire's everlasting swarm. In the time when the forest turns ashen and gold, and the summer's demise in the leaves is extolled, Etna, when Venus visits her retreat, treading your lava with innocent feet, Though a sad sleep thunders and the flame burns cold, I hold the queen, sure punishment. No, but the soul, weighed down by the body, wordless, struck dumb, to noon's proud silence must at last succumb. And so let me sleep, oblivious of sin, stretched out on the thirsty sand, drinking in the bountiful rays of the wine-growing star. Couple, farewell, I'll see the shade that now you are. So, I mean, it's really quite an amazing poem. The sound is fabulous, and the imagery is complex and challenging and interesting and multi-layered. And I think that's really one of the elements here that's so revolutionary in the context of the mid to late 19th century and the way that people wrote poetry about classical subject matter, pastoral poetry, traditional poetry in sort of Alexandrine forms, or there's poems in just the four that are included here that are sonnets. The Tomb of Edgar Poe is one. The Virginal, Vibrant, and Beautiful Dawn is another sonnet. These very traditional approaches, and yet Mallarmé is taking them in these unique ways, and particularly he's raising a lot of doubts and questions and uncertainties about the things that are ostensibly occurring in these poems. I mean, you look at just the last few lines of this poem. No, but the soul, weighted down by the body, wordless, struck dumb, to noon's proud silence must at last succumb, and so let me sleep, oblivious of sin. This idea of sleeping, dreaming, this experience of like, is this reality? Is this a dream? We have this uncertainty. And then the last line, couple, farewell, I'll see the shade that now you are. Shades are dreams, are spirits, are things that are unreal. So again, we've got this element of uncertainty that is purposefully introduced by Mallarmé to raise these questions about truth, beauty, reality, romantic love, etc., etc.